And too often, there's one other ingredient, which is corruption. It's cheaper to pay a government official a bribe of 10,000 or even 10 million than to pay the full market value for your oil. There is now a case pending, for instance, in Mobile in Kazakhstan. We don't know, of course, the outcome of that, but from what one has read from the media, it looks fairly clear. Of course, Exxon says, we don't know, we just paid the money to this guy who was supposed to facilitate the transaction. But obviously, when you're paying millions and millions of dollars, you weren't just buying the time of the facilitator. That money was going somewhere, and it was pretty clear where that money was going. So this has been one of the real problems. It's not an accident that so many of the oil-rich countries or mineral resource-rich countries are undemocratic and corrupt. It takes two to tango, as we say. It takes two to have corruption, a briber and a bribee. And unfortunately, too often, the international companies have seen the temptation and have given in. The result of all of these forces is that, unfortunately, we have what is called the natural resource curse, sometimes referred to as the paradox of plenty. You would have expected that countries with a rich endowment of natural resources would grow faster. They would be better off. But across the world, what we see is that countries with large endowments of natural resources do not grow faster. What they do have is a superabundance of dictators and corrupt governments. And so rather than the money going to the growth of the economy, the well-being of the citizens, to the reduction of poverty, it goes to a few people at the top. And then the Western governments facilitate this in another way. Not only do they give it the money, but then they use that money to buy arms. Very lucrative arms trade. And that arms are used then to suppress the people. And then, so there's a vicious circle. You have the preservation of these dictatorships, the money and the arms sales together, and the corruption lead to a continuation of situations where you have undemocratic governments, where the money is not being used to promote economic growth and poverty reduction. If this were just one or two countries, you would say it's an exception. But the fact that it is so many suggests that there is a pattern that needs to be broken. There are things that can be done. We can make globalization work. We can, for instance, require the oil companies to disclose every payment they make. This initiative of transparency was one that BP actually tried to introduce in Angola. A Norwegian company called Hydro also tried to do it. These are companies that are committed to social responsibility, to trying to make globalization work. And so they said, we're going to make sure that everybody knows how much we're giving the government, and if you also know how much you sell, you can figure out what the price is, and you can assess whether they're getting fair market value. The Angolan government said, no, if you do that, you're out of the country. There's sometimes an appeal to business secrecy. Well, what you know is when there's business secrecy in this area, well, this is really, there are no real legitimate arguments for secrecy. It is really an attempt to hide what is going on. Unfortunately, the United States has not set the best example here. U.S. policy in the area of energy, set by the beginning of the Bush administration by a meeting where the government won't even disclose who was at the meeting. We know who it was. It was mostly energy executives. The proposals that came out of that were called, even by one of President Bush's own party, the bill that left no lobbyists behind. Everybody had their, as we say, they're trying to feed at the trough to get more money from the government. But it wasn't addressing the country's energy needs. But this secrecy even goes to the point of the contracts that the government often signs. There was a recent concern. Why, with oil prices and gas prices so high, why hasn't government revenues, U.S. government revenues from oil and gas increased commensurately? Obviously, something very strange about the contracts. But the oil companies and gas companies have not made those contracts fully public. In the developing countries, the problem, of course, are in many cases even worse. So there was an international movement called transparency to try to make sure that they make transparent what they pay to the countries. It would be very easy to force the companies to do it. All you would have to have is the tax authorities and the United States, G7, other advanced industrial countries to say, if you don't disclose what you pay, you can't get a tax deduction. They would disclose it. Obviously, it's more valuable for them to have a tax deduction. So we need to move, we need to change the way globalization is managed. These are simple changes that could have an enormous change. It would actually be promoting democracy. Another change is we need to discourage arms sales, because these arms sales are what maintain these dictators in these countries. At the very least, we should make it more costly. We should tax these arms sales, because these arms sales are what give rise to this enormous conflict, which has been probably the most important impediment to development in sub-Saharan Africa. Economists call this an externality, a cost that the arms sellers don't bear, but the rest of society does bear. So there should be a tax on this. The revenue from the tax could actually be used to promote development. Erased.